Welcome, everyone. I am Patty Zimmerman, and with my colleague, Tom Chevery, we are the co-directors of the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival. At exactly this time last year, we shuttered our embodied festival and ran 3 online exhibitions. This year, we welcome you to the 24th edition of the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival. This year is a historic year. COVID, protests on racial inequalities, masks, vaccines, remote learning, the Zoomiverse, and the yearning for connections around ideas and community. This year, for the very first time in 24 years, we are 100% virtual. We have 2 FLEFF mottos this year: FLEFF, a different environment, and the other motto, we are the screen. Both were created and developed by our wonderful festival producers, Anne Michelle and Phil Wild from Insights International. We are delighted and honored that all of you from everywhere can join us today across borders for this book launch of a very timely and important and urgent book, The Roots of Fake News, Objecting to Objective Journalism, by Brian Winston and Matthew Winston, joining us from the United Kingdom today. We will be doing short introductions to save time for dialogue. During this event, please look at the chat for the extended bios, more links, and references. Participants should use the chat for questions as they think of them. Our producer, Phil Wild, may end up reading some of them out loud during the Q&A if we get a stockpile of questions. At the end of this session, we ask all of you to unmute your microphones and to put your video on to applaud our presenters at the end of this book launch. I know they will really appreciate it. And now I'd like to introduce my wonderful colleague, Raza Rumi, who is director of the Park Center for Independent Media at Ithaca College. The Park Center is a co-sponsor of this launch. Professor Rumi's books include Delhi by Heart, Impressions of a Pakistani Traveler, The Fractious Path, Pakistan's Democratic Transition, Identity, Faith, and Conflict, and Being Pakistani, Society, Culture, and the Arts. Raza?
Thank you so much, Dr. Zimmerman. Indeed, a pleasure, as always, to collaborate with you and FLEFF in particular. The Park Center for Independent Media at Ithaca College strives to build collaborations across the campus and the community to bring forward independent media studies, as well as highlight the practitioners who are in this particular domain. And I'm very honored that I was chosen to moderate this session, and especially about a book which is most engaging, and as we shall find out, uncovers many important facets of contemporary debates on fake news, a concept which has been overused and perhaps abused at times as well. So let me introduce the two great panelists with us who have co-authored this book, The Roots of Fake News, Objecting to Objective Journalism. Brian Winston is the Lincoln Professor at the University of Lincoln in the UK. His primary interests his primary areas of interest are freedom of speech, journalism, history, media, technology, and documentary film. His co-author, Matthew Winston, teaches in the School of Media, Communication, and Sociology at the University of Leicester. He also focuses on the history of American journalism, theories of subjective journalism, and ideas surrounding media representations of drugs and drugs cultures. So welcome to both the Winstons. And I think before we go on, I would like to remind the audience to please make your mobile phone silent and mute your mics so that we can hear our speakers clearly. So over to you, Brian, and I would like to start with you. And I think one of the questions which is, I mean, of course, I'm personally very interested, but I'm sure most of the people here in this meeting today would like to know why this book and why at this juncture. And maybe you can shed some light on that. And then I will ask the same question to Matthew, and we'll then continue the conversation.
Well, why at this juncture is simply it's not at this juncture, right? It got delayed and etc. etc. It wasn't. I felt really we were perhaps a bit behind the eight ball. I didn't expect that you know, the thing would continue to be so vibrant into this present moment. But the bottom line about it is that I was actually exploring with Matthew what he was interested in a paternal sort of way. You haven't mentioned our relationship, so he's my son. And I was thinking, well, maybe I should encourage him to do something, right? Essentially. And I thought I'd encourage him and then I'd walk away and let him get on with it. And I said to him, you know, what I remember in Leicester, we were having an Indian, actually rather obviously subcontinental meal, as you know, in his city where he lives in England has a very large population. And it has the best food in England in consequence. And we were having lunch and I said, what would you like to do? And he said, well, you know, I'm interested in Hunter Thompson, right, which was his dissertation subject and so on. And I really object to objective journalism as a concept. And I thought to myself, oh, this is a really interesting idea. So what became a sort of thought, a parental thought that I should encourage him, became actually an opportunity to lay out a whole bunch of stuff that I've been worrying about forever. And that's my explanation. I've never really worked out why he bothered with me, actually.
Okay, so wonderful. Thank you, Brian. Matthew, maybe the same question for you. I mean, your co-author and your father, and yes, I should have introduced that right at the very start. But anyway, better late than never. So maybe you can also elaborate a little more on the concept and the thinking that went into the writing of this book.
Absolutely. In the course of doing my doctoral study, which turned into my first book, it was a study of the gonzo journalism of Hunter S. Thompson. I've always found Hunter Thompson and the idea of how that fits in with journalism. I've been reading him since I was a kid, and I thought it was an interesting area. And in the course of doing that study, I ended up thinking about how the way his kind of hyper-subjective mixing fiction and non-fiction, but still trying to fulfill a journalistic purpose, his gonzo journalism, the way it kind of just problematizes the idea of objective journalism and the idea of journalists being able to tell the truth. There's a quote in the book that Brian and I are both very fond of, where Hunter Thompson once said that objective journalism is a pompous contradiction in terms. And that was over. And yeah, like my dad said, we were talking about what I should do next in terms of research. And the idea was that I wanted to kind of articulate the theoretical framework of what I thought about objective journalism, which is more or less that it's a pompous contradiction in terms, rather than just in terms of Hunter Thompson, but kind of make the general case. And Brian, as a much better historian than me, and with his expertise in the theory around documentary and truth, thought that there was a profitable intersection and that we would collaborate. But at that point, and for a while we were talking about this, we're going to be doing a book about why we think objective journalism is a big problem. And then one day I was watching the television and Kellyanne Conway said, well, those are alternative facts. And I thought, really, the book we're doing might have to talk about the world, because so yeah, how did we end up responding to this urgent moment? We were already thinking about things, and then the urgent moment came to us. I think probably on the larger scale, we'd have just as soon it hadn't, but but yeah, that's I think that's sort of what happened, wouldn't you say? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good articulation. I mean, we were certainly thinking in the long term, and then obviously the election happened, and then we had this whole brouhaha, which is actually slightly to the side of what we were interested in, but obviously necessitated the initial impulse became more necessary, right? Absolutely right.
No, that's really interesting, and part of the reasons that I chose the word juncture, Brian, right at the start, was to do with the fact that here, at least in the US, this whole notion of objectivity, and as in binary with fake news. I mean, so it has actually ends up misinforming the publics, across the countries. And in fact, this particular discourse then travels globally. So in most countries, you'll find, this debate on objectivity, quote unquote. So I would very much like to maybe start with you, Brian, and then Matthew. I mean, your major critiques, I mean, that you've documented both from a historical as well as a philosophical, approach. What is so wrong, or what is the problem there with the term objectivity in itself?
Well, objective. I mean, the way we approached it was we're grounding this in an assumption about how the disciplines work. So not every discipline is dedicated to the pursuit of truth overtly, but history and all those humanities are, and philosophy is, and science is, and the law is. And it occurred to us that when you look at the protocols of the three more distant, i.e. assuming history is quite close to journalism, journalism being history in a hurry, when you look at the other three, you can see they are all adopting protocols which are not part of journalism and never have been. And when I say never, I mean never. That is to say, not ancient stuff on the walls of Rome, but certainly everything after the diffusion of printing from movable type in the West. And that has always involved subterfuge. And in fact, if you look at the early centuries, our conclusion is that truth, right, is a brand for journalists. It's not a promise. It's just something you put on everything. Dragons seen in skies over Paris, 1694, véritable, right? That's how you sell the stuff. And it's only far more recently, i.e. within almost living memory, i.e. a century at the most, and in America initially, that the whole idea of truthfulness becoming glossed, as it were, as objectivity, comes into play. But it comes into play without adopting the protocols. You do not say, reporting a car crash, could you do it again, for instance? I mean, scientists live by that, fiat experimentum. Make a careful, diligenta, make a careful experiment, right? Do it again and do it again and do it again. And slowly you realize that it's not quite working. And oh dear, the earth isn't the center of the universe. Maybe I don't believe this because you'll burn me if I say this, but Mr. Copernicus says, let's imagine the sun is it. Let's just imagine that the sun is it. That's how science works, right? Not all sciences, because a bunch of humanistic sciences have decided to call themselves sciences when, as far as Thomas Kuhn's concerned, they're pre-paradigmatic, they're not really sciences. So we're talking about real sciences. Law, you say X and Kellyanne says alternate facts, right? One side says one thing, one side says another, and you come to some sort of judgment. And philosophy, of course, worries endlessly about this, very carefully. But for journalists, one of our other favorite quotations is from Gordon Bennett, not the father, who was one of the fathers of American popular press, but his son, who was notorious, of course, James Gordon Bennett Jr., who actually said, many a good story has been ruined by over-verification, right? So we felt that we were in a position historically to call into question the idea of, to historicize the idea of objectivity, because it seemed to us that people assumed that objectivity and truthfulness and everything were essential to quote unquote good journalism, when in fact they're tangential to it, they're not essential to it, and in fact could obscure. Right. That's right, isn't it, Matthew? Approximately.
Yeah. Matthew, maybe you can add more to it.
Like I think we say in the introduction, I think the biggest problem with objective journalism from an ideological perspective is that people think it's possible. And you get into all sorts of trouble from people thinking that it's possible. Because I mean, just on a very basic thing, one thing that the two things I always like to say when I'm explaining this to undergrads are, one, that you just the thought experiment of a reporter doing a report about a land development. Some wetlands are going to be turned into a golf course and maybe a hotel. And as a journalist, you can talk about the business side of things, jobs, investment in the area, and people will say you're biased in favor of business and against the environment. You could talk about the environmental impact, and people will say you're biased in favor of the environment or against business. There's no way of giving every conceivable context, and therefore it's just a bizarre concept to apply to the situation, as though there's some objectively correct way of reporting it. There's a reason they're called stories, and stories, you have to limit the frame, you have to go from, there's nothing from before the beginning and nothing after the end, and your viewpoint has its limitations. It's not just that objectivity is, it's not the idea that objectivity is bad. The problem is the notion that objectivity is remotely applicable. And one thing that's interesting, when people talk about objectivity, they always talk at this level of the story. But one thing that's very important for people to think about when you're trying to think about objective journalism is that that isn't the unit. The unit is the broadcast or the page or the whole paper. And again, the thought experiment, obviously, once you start thinking about story selection, the idea of objectivity again becomes ridiculous. I can't remember which two we picked as an example, but the notion that, you know, if you only have room for one of them in your American national newspaper, and it's that there's been a landslide in Bolivia, 200 dead, versus China completes oil pipeline into wherever. Again, it's not so that the notion that objectivity can be applied to this the way it can to the boiling point of water, or trying to establish the truth of a legal matter, or, as my father was saying, it would obviously be possible to make a completely biased newspaper without having any biased stories in it, just by what you choose to report and not to report. And news selection can't be anything other than subjective. So just sort of at every level. And as we also say in the book, even if you do produce objective journalism, even if that were possible, and it isn't, thinking about it in those terms forgets that communication has to be a circuit. And and endless research shows that even if you were able to write the news objectively, it doesn't get interpreted objectively by its audiences, meaning that it's not an objective communication anyway. Whatever that would be, I have no idea. But it's like Homo economicus. It's one of those abstractions that seems like it's sort of, oh, well, close enough. And it actually just wreaks havoc to any kind of systems of thought that build on it or link to it.
Sorry, Matt. I
Go for it.
just want to say one thing, that there's a lot of what we've just been saying, of course, which people will recognize as not coming from us as original. And that has to be acknowledged. But I mean, we just wanted to put that together. There is a debate in journalism studies. I'm looking at some extremely distinguished doyens of the American Journalism Academy. As I say this, there's a debate which has been going on for a long time about when was objectivity, right? I mean, we're riding on the back of that and trying to historicize it even further, if you like. But you know, that it's important to acknowledge that this book is a synthesizing, as much as it is anything else, of other people's important thinking, I think. And Matthew, I know, would agree with that. He's shaking his head. Yep. Okay, thank you, Raza. Sorry.
No, thank you for this intervention. And that was my view as well when I was reading the book over the weekend, past weekend. So obviously you can see I was having a good time. You know, so lots of references, and really it backs so many important debates, and from different disciplines, which is again a great feature of this book, you know, whether it's law or it's philosophy, or is it pure media studies? And so anyway, going back to what Matthew was saying earlier, and the book also posits that, you know, the crisis is of fake news, quote unquote, as is put out in the popular domain, is not so much a crisis of journalism per se, but it's a crisis of perhaps how we tend to believe in certain news, and this whole debate on objectivity versus subjectivity is therefore a problematic debate to begin with. So I do want to, because I mean, you know, our audience is so diverse, I would like to raise this question to both you and Brian, Matt, is that how in the current sort of moment of 2021, post-truth, alt facts, alt reality, and all the buzzwords that are found in headlines and op-eds and newspaper features. How would you place this particular debate on objectivity in this current climate? Because I mean, what is happening perhaps in the US is not all too dissimilar from what is happening in the UK, or for that matter, Brazil, or I mean, the same kinds of debates on both the ends. And I would like you to contextualize your research into this very moment, because that is something I know that the audience would be interested in. And I'm sure they have questions as well around that.
I think one of the tricky things about fake news is that it's three ideas hiding together under a trench coat. Because when we talk about fake news, we're talking both about hoax news, incorrect, deliberately lying news being promulgated, often on politically partisan lines, and supposedly having a lot to do with the affordances of Web 2.0. And fake news also being a not particularly new, but rearisen term for a very old concept where a populist leader, when journalists say this populist leader is doing bad things or is bad for the country or criticize them in any way, saying they are the enemies of the state and the enemies of the people, because the populist leader is the state and the people. And that's, that is one way in which Trump emulated Hitler, just less eloquently, in simply, if the media is critical of me, it is because the media is the enemy of the people. And the thing is, those two ideas have some things in common, but it's sort of hard to talk about them both at the same time. But one other thing that I think it's important to mention is that fake news, in terms of that first term, is not a crisis, it's just a moral panic. It's, there's this fear that somewhere out there, Cambridge Analytica and/or Russian troll farms are using Facebook to brainwash, not you, you're fine, whoever you are, obviously you're too clever for that, but they're brainwashing your stupid neighbors and we're all gonna die. And it's a classic moral panic. It works perfectly with all the features that Cohen describes. And it does, to a certain extent, empower and correlate to the populist, when someone like Trump says something is fake news, he's not saying it's dishonest. It's a way of, it's not dishonesty, it's just dissent. That's what makes you fake news for someone like Trump or Bolsonaro, or on and on. I don't want to name unpleasant people. But that first thing, that moral panic, has been, as Brian was saying, has been centuries in the making. It does sort of, or at least it goes back, let's say, a century-ish, possibly a century and a bit, depending how you look at it. Roughly speaking, not to sound too militant leftist, it does sort of come about simply as a response to organized labor and the working classes' dissatisfaction with the fact that the news media speak only for the class of people who own the news media. Brian, who was it who said freedom of the press applies only to those who own one?
Liebling.
Thank you.
Anyone in America is free to buy a newspaper, you know.
Yeah,
Anybody who, sorry, let me get the quote right. It's a disservice to one of my heroes, right? Anybody in America is free to start a newspaper. All you need, he wrote this half a century ago, all you need is $1 million and a lot, all you need in a mid-sized city like Worcester, Massachusetts is $1 million and a lot of sporting blood. And we're free to buy the newspaper or not. So the freedom of the press is indeed, by that token, illusory.
Yeah, and they start to get into trouble about this, the people who own the newspapers and indeed the rest of everything. And it's an oversimplification, but to a certain extent, professional objective journalism gets thought up as a swindle, as a way of obscuring that, saying it doesn't matter that I own this newspaper, my reporters will be professional and objective. And, you know, a few decades later, it's Rupert Murdoch promising that he won't interfere with the editor of the Times, and possibly, not even sure he made it to the end of the day, probably, but it's about class interests to a certain extent. I mean, in addition to the philosophical problems and the epistemological problems, objectivity has always been a nightmare politically. I mean, that's been endlessly studied, the way in which, by definition, the nature of how you use sources and how beats are organized has always tended to advantage. It gives officials and governmental sources the chance to be the initial framers of the issue. You know, all that stuff. In addition to which, it does open the door to a certain extent, eventually, for, in a sort of postmodernist nightmare made flesh, the rise of a news network, I don't need to say it, you all know the one I mean, that broadcasts simply from an alternate world.
I think, can I historicize this a little further? Because I think that the bottom line is that Matthew came up with this wonderful, in the course of writing it, one of the things that really struck me was, in the course of a conversation, he suddenly said, you know, so what was wrong with the 18th century American partisan press? They didn't do badly, did they? Right? I mean, Thomas Paine, right? You know, and we quote in the book, Matthew came up with this line, I'm stealing it from him, you know, Thomas Paine never asked George III for his view, right? You know, there's a sense in which all of this is extremely time honored, and the analysis that Matthew gave you of the different sorts of fakery lead us to actually propose a sort of continuum. And what the conclusion that we've reached is that Trump and the rhetoric around that has no place on that continuum. You know, there's no point in journalism discussing with any seriousness, you know, not running news that people don't like, right? Whether they're the president or anybody else. You know, there has to be a right to offend if there's a right to free expression. I mean, obviously, the right to offend is the right under the law. I mean, I'm not making a lunatic libertarian argument, but within that constraint, right, there has to be a right to offend. And the notion that somebody can stand up and say, I don't like this story, you know, no, I had the biggest, you know, inauguration, to come back to the newscast, or one of them that prompted this, you know, I had the biggest inauguration crowd in history. Well, yes, all these photographs are fake. I mean, that is pointless, right? There's no point in having, I mean, that takes a 30-second dismissal. What's really interesting is, you know, the continuum from the uplands of fiction across to the boiling point of water, right? From a galaxy far away to ice feels cold. You know, where is all this? Well, it's in a swamp in the middle. Is the point we would want to make, that at the end of the day, you take a whole bunch of objective, you know, boiling point water stories, and where you situate them on the page will not help them be the final word, because they can't be. And that really is the critical point. And it goes all the way across then to, you know, misrepresentation. Misrepresentation is a real problem. Because of placement or because of selectivity, you know, and we begin the book by talking about, you know, somebody whom everybody knows, you know, the Valvoida of Wallachia in the 15th century, which, you know, a man known to everybody as an exemplary fascistic, awful killer of his population, and a disastrous person. He was the Devil Prince. I believe the Romanian is Dracul Varga, and you all know him as Dracula. And the news book came out in 1485, and it was in print for 20 or 30 years. And here we are centuries later, and the poor old soul, he's still only a hero in Romania, a defender of Christendom against the Turk, right? I mean, there's a whole other alternative fact about Dracula, you know, you want to know. So you know, it's inevitable, and it's a continuum, and to just talk about it in terms of fakery is obviously necessary, because you've got to clear the ground. But fakery itself is actually comparatively rare. We make this point, you know, we know what the great fake stories are. The great moon hoax, you know, of 1835, when the New York Sun produced a series of stories about the great astronomer Herschel. Yes, he's objectively a real astronomer with a telescope. Yes, there are telescopes. With an enormous telescope. Well, he didn't actually build an enormous telescope. It situated it in the Cape of Good Hope. Well, there is the Cape of Good Hope, and he saw winged creatures flying around on the moon, right? I mean, you know, complete fakery. And there's a famous British one where the Communist Party, Zinoviev, the foreign, you know, the chap in charge of fomenting revolution around the world in the Soviets in 1923, there was a Labour, there was an election, and the Daily Mail ran a story that Zinoviev had communicated with British communists, telling them to have a general strike and overthrow the government. All complete fiction. And do you know, the Daily Mail, to celebrate the 75th anniversary of this, ran the goddamn thing again, right? I mean, what are you going to do about that? You can't, you know, that is sort of endless. But it's important to think of it as a continuum, you know, because on the one hand, there is the galaxy far away, and on the other hand, there has to be, and the popularizing of postmodernism hasn't helped this. You know, there was a war in the Gulf. Sorry, Jacques. The fact of the matter is that at the other end of the continuum, there are facts, you know, and to insert a notion of objectivity into the middle of that discussion is to obscure the ways in which we can actually get to, as it were, as consumers, the facts.
Yes, thank you so much, Brian. And so I, you know, I'd like to remind the those who are participating that please feel free to post your questions in the chat box. Your questions and or brief comments. Please keep them brief and succinct. And we shall certainly take them up with both Brian and Matthew. So, I mean, I do, in the book, you also propose an alternative ideology, an alternative way to look at this whole construct. And so maybe, Matthew, you can elaborate that a little bit for those who would hopefully get the book and read it.
That would be nice.
Yeah, I think, like possibly most people who've thought about it at all, I sort of thought of professional journalism as being sort of absently, I think it's sort of a hegemonic idea, but professional objective journalism being kind of the start of modern, civilized, good journalism. Before that, it's all free-for-all craziness of various kinds. But reading about the history of American journalism, and particularly about the, it's an article, and I'm going to forget who wrote it. It's in the American Journalism History Reader, but anyway, about the Jacksonian era press. And there was this thing in it, terrible, I'm stealing somebody's idea now, oh well. It's that at the time, newspapers were they were privately patronized, and they were publicly subsidized, and they were openly politically campaigning. They would be tied to parties and factions of parties, and it was considered a part of a newspaperman's job to address the reader as a citizen, as part of a democracy, as someone who, quite apart from anything else, was going to be going to a voting booth at some point. And it said in this article that objectivity wasn't thought of so much as good or bad, but simply, thanks Brian, but simply as inappropriate, as not relevant. And it said that if not giving an opinion would be thought of as having there'd be one of two reasons why a newspaperman would, and it would be a man, would try to, till Nellie Bly, sorry, would try to avoid giving an opinion. And that would be either you don't have an opinion or you're not brave enough to share it. And neither of those was considered okay. And that ties in with, again, something I'd read of Hunter Thompson talking about particularly how free he was reporting about the 1972 US presidential election compared to how shackled and constrained most reporters were. I think at one point he refers to, for an example of his kind of open, subjective, these are my impressions. I think at one point he said that being on the campaign trail with Hubert Humphrey was like being trapped in a rolling boxcar with a 300-pound sewer rat. Something like that. But all these arguments make more sense to me than the idea that I'm going to try to be objective. I'm going to try to avoid, I'm going to keep my opinions out of it. Why not? Context must be opinion, and to a certain extent, opinion should be context. One of the reasons that objective journalism has become so problematic as an ideology is we've seen that balance, just the concept of balance, has been fetishized until it leads into sheer insanity. You know, I have, by definition, if I'm talking about something on the news that is remotely controversial, I must have one person sitting on one side of me who is for it, and one person sitting on the other side of me who is against it, even if it is the boiling point of water, right? At this point, many journalists, more so in some parts of the world than in others, it should be noted, but many journalists, you know, you imagine a presidential debate or a political debate, and that two-party system, Democrats, Republicans. I'll situate this imagined incident in America, and one guy says, one person says, "It's a beautiful day today. The weather is beautiful. The sun is shining. It's a glorious day in America." And the other one says, "I don't know what my opponent is saying. It's raining. It's terrible. The weather is awful. It's freezing out here. There's sleet. It's horrible." And somehow we've reached a point where reporters think that being a good journalist means saying, well, this one said this and that one said that. And they don't look out the window anymore.
Yeah, we
and
just had
say this one was lying.
we just had a wonderful example of that, which I think has actually, I would go so far as to say, has actually crossed some lives, which is herd immunity.
Yes.
Which did, I mean, herd immunity. On the 3rd of March last year, when Johnson for the very first time appeared here, flanked by the 2 leading scientists of the country. And they didn't say herd immunity, but they were guessing at herd immunity. And then herd immunity entered the discourse of the newspapers. And I'm not talking about the papers, that were taking a view here that the whole thing was overblown and we shouldn't lock down, etc., etc. But even the radical papers, Guardian and so on. And in the summer of last year, you got, well, some people say herd immunity is not possible, and other people say it isn't, because journalists are very good at speaking truth to power. Our journalists were terrific. Failings about protective equipment, lack of ventilators, every scandal you want instantly turned over, skewering everybody left and right. But when the journalist has to confront the scientist, speaking truth to science, far more difficult. For one thing, they don't understand probabilistics, so that's a real problem. But for another thing, when they're faced with something like herd immunity, they say, well, these other scientists say herd immunity. The other scientists are flat earthers. On March the 3rd of last year, the only thing you could do to halt the spread of this contagion was lockdown, because herd immunity requires A, that the infection can be survived and will give immunity, B, you need a therapy, there were none, right? And C, you need 70% of the population to have it. Well, 70% of the population means that what's the death rate of the infectivity? You don't know. And they knew enough probabilistically to know they were talking about 500,000 dead. And they decided, I suspect, although it hasn't come out yet, that they couldn't possibly say anything like that. So we got all this nonsense, which is then duly being reported by the papers slowly over the next several months as an alternative fact, right? When in fact it was, and only now starts to become, a reasonable assumption, right? We're now getting to the point where you can start to think about herd immunity because we have a therapy, right? So that's the sort of thing that we're trying to get at. We're not at all interested in Trump, actually, per se. I mean, that is just uninteresting. But what is interesting is how you cope with this. And we've come up, subsequent to the publication of the book, we've come up with, with a concept of facticity. What we're talking about is facticity. Have you got a fact here? And it's when the facticity becomes in question that you should start to worry about the newspaper, because objectivity is to do with something to do with the mindset of the writers, of the producers of the news. Whereas in fact, the only thing you can rely on is your ability to triangulate what they tell you. And that is to do with facticity, and it's important. And I haven't found the scholar, Matthew.
I found it. I found it.
Who is it?
Sorry, guiltily, that was Gerald Baldesty.
Gerald Baldesty, that's right. But I found from the book a couple of things which are pertinent to this part of the discussion, rather. It is in 1841, Horace Greeley, right? Go West, young man. He actually started a newspaper, the New York Tribune, because, and this was his editorial position upon reflection, because my leading idea was the establishment of a journal removed alike from servile partisanship on the one hand, okay, and from gagged neutrality on the other, right? So, Michael Shudson, who obviously ought to figure in this conversation somewhere, went on to say, we quoted him as saying, in terms of talking about objectivity, it seemed to become a natural and progressive ideology for an aspiring occupational group at a moment when science was God, efficiency was cherished, and increasingly prominent elites judged partisanship a vestige of the tribal 19th century. So that's Michael Shudson nailing his flag to the objectivity didn't exist before the coming of the J School in the University of Missouri in, I believe, 1911. I don't know whether anybody's here from Missouri.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Brian and Matthew. We have now quite a few questions waiting for us. So I'll start one by one. I mean, this was fascinating, and I still have many other questions, but I guess I'll have to now defer to our esteemed participants here. So the first one is by our friend and former colleague, Maura Stephens, who cites an article from the Nature and says a new article in the journal Nature suggests that sharing fake news, which happens all too regularly on social media, is more a result of inattention than actual belief, and that if people who share such false news are prodded to question its accuracy, they're less likely to disseminate it. So have the authors found such to be true? Either of you.
Would that it were.
I think we don't think fake news is really a thing in that sense. We have issues with the presuppositions about the categories, because there is this notion. I mean, to a certain extent, there is the extreme case, and it does get confusing. But to a certain extent, it tends to be levels of distortion, because, like we've been saying, none of this is the boiling point of water. So don't get me wrong, there are sometimes hoaxes floating around like they're news, but usually it's distortions. It's how you frame things, it's how you refer to things. Hillary Clinton didn't say rich guys like Trump should run for president, but she did say that rich people should run for office because they can't be bought. Admittedly, I don't like that one either. But it's always, I think it's always about how things are presented and in what way. You do get the fake news stories floating around. The Pope endorses Trump, but I don't know. I'm not convinced this is. One of the other things we talk about, of course, is the notion that all of this, to a certain extent, presupposes direct effects.
Exactly.
Like
Yes.
if you're talking about the passing around of fake news, sorry, I'm sort of dodging the question a bit, but perhaps people's inattention as they're circulating it, the interesting conclusion to draw from that isn't necessarily, I don't know the article obviously, isn't necessarily that, oh, if we can just get people to think about it, they won't do it. It might be that it doesn't matter anyway because they're not paying that much attention. What if actually people en masse are probably not going to the voting booth and actually thinking, well, I can't vote for him. He's a, Muslim communist who was born in Kenya. But actually, it's fireworks rather than mortars. It's visible and it's spectacular, but it's not actually at the heart of the matter. People like it plays into the thing about moral panics. People like to think that, for example, Cambridge Analytica swung Brexit because they don't want to think that it's actually about long-term trends in the squeezing of the middle class, post-austerity politics, sublimated rage from 2008. You don't want to look at the fact that actually everybody who voted for Brexit, interestingly, it's everybody who owns their home outright or is renting. It's the people with mortgages who voted against it, and it works perfectly because that's a much less fun thing to think about than the idea that Mark Zuckerberg's magic toy box got hijacked by some slick, evil data hustlers who are reprogramming all our minds. That's a lot more fun than you know, we've actually got problems because of neoliberalism usually.
Yeah.
My father and I have a game. It's the idea that if you look at any serious societal problem, you have to work out in less than 6 steps how the ultimate solution is to crush global capitalism.
No, but actually, can I just pick up on this? You know, the point about impact implicit in the question is actually quite interesting, because we've had a century pretty much a century of serious sociological, if that's not an oxymoron to a certain extent, serious sociological examination of the impact, and we can't. The noise in the social sphere doesn't mesh with isolating the impact of individual communications. And I further have a feeling, I haven't done the sociology, that if you can demonstrate impact, i.e. billions of pounds worth of advertising, not all useless, then it's because what's being advertised isn't that important. It's one brand of coffee over another. But if you want me to, you know, change my political orientation, which is, yes, influenced by the media, but also by a lot of other things as well, then that becomes more difficult. Unless my own state of mind is such that I'm susceptible to messages. And the clearest demonstration of impact that I know of individual messages is the Werther effect, is the unfortunate, and I believe this is facticity, that if you give detailed accounts of suicides, how to do it, etc., in newspapers or on the media in general, you will get copycat effects. And psychologists call this the Werther effect, after young Werther. I think that, so that there's a question of, you know, the seriousness of the message, what it's devoted to, and also the state of mind of the receiver. None of that applies. If you want to fix the British election or anybody else's election, I think there are very few methods superior to handing out brown envelopes containing, you know, a few quid, really. It's like keeping secrets. You want to keep a secret, you know, type it on an IBM Selectric and put it in a shop safe. I mean, it's easy to overstate the impact of these things. We're not dismissing how important it is to tackle this. But it is very difficult to grasp it in terms of the present framing of the argument. That's what we're saying, I think.
Right. Thank you, Brian. And the next question is from Harriet Malinowitz, who says, how might Walter Lippmann, with his ideas of stereotypes and the pictures in our heads, fit into this continuum of fakeness, factuality?
Oh, gosh. How will it fit into our mental pictures? I mean, I think this is sort of Cartesian, you know, this is the essential Cartesian quandary, isn't it? You know, I learned only recently, I shared this with Matthew only today, that the argument I'm about to deploy now has a Latin tag, which I never knew. It's the ad judicatum ad lapidum, the argument of the stone. You know, Dr. Johnson is walking along with Boswell, and they're talking about Bishop Berkeley, and it's all in your head, and you can't be sure about anything. And Dr. Johnson kicks the stone, an argumentum ad lapidum stone. And I think that Lippmann's notion of that is. Lippmann is one of the fathers of the assumption that there is an impact. Remember, he's writing at a time when the first emergent theory of media effects is the hypodermic needle, right? You know, if you listen to this, if you listen to me now, you will all go and buy this book, right? I mean, come on, it's not the way it works. It's far more complicated than that. So I think he would certainly be joining in the debate quite furiously, but he wouldn't be necessarily adding very much to it, I'm afraid, I have to say. Although, you know, I'm not against Lippmann. I'm not as much in favor of Lippmann as I am of Liebling, I have to tell you.
Okay, thank you. And maybe we can move on to the next question. So Grace Bonner, who's I think a student at Ithaca College, if I'm not mistaken. Grace says, if objective journalism is impossible, what's the best way for the general public to consume their news?
Do you want to do that, Matthew?
Yes.
objective journalism being impossible doesn't mean that good journalism is impossible. I mean, we're all familiar with what good subjective journalism is. We sometimes call it creative nonfiction. We sometimes call it long form journalism. We sometimes call it literary journalism. But it's the likes of Hunter S. Thompson might be a bit spicy for you, but it is the likes of. It's hard for me not to go to Tom Wolfe and the gang.
Or James Cameron, if there are any elderly Brits tuned in.
Yeah, Truman Capote. We're all familiar with this concept. I mean, and even in sort of people who are in that other tradition, we've all seen examples of it. You know, people reporting from a famine or a disaster or a war, and an honest human response that is labeled as such. This is not me pretending to be a robot documenting the scene. This is me telling you the story of me as a human being here. And I think basically that's the best way to report anything, particularly because there's no other way. There's only sort of intrinsic dishonesty. As Hunter Thompson said, with the possible exception of baseball scores and the oscillations of the stock market, everything else by definition, and I'm wandering from him now, but everything else by definition is telling a story. And I came here by way of literature. My bachelor's and my master's are English literature. And, you know, one of the things a story has to have is a teller, one way or another, whether they are visible or invisible. Every story is told from a perspective. Every story leaves things out and puts things in. There's no profit in pretending that the storyteller isn't there. So basically what I think is we need everything to become a mixture of literary journalism and the weird, angry, political, fighting of the 1830s. This is a war of opinions. This is a marketplace of ideas. It isn't working to say, I'm not in a war of opinions or a marketplace of ideas. I am here and I have hung out my facts for sale. It causes problems. It isn't true. It doesn't work. I think we need to reform things as it is. Just to give one example, talking about the best ways of consuming the news, I will freely admit my primary source of news, my primary source of trying to understand what's happening, particularly at a national political level in America, is that I watch Stephen Colbert's YouTube channel, and Trevor Noah, and Seth Meyers, and John Oliver. Those guys are how I find out about America, because they aren't just going to tell me they aren't just going to tell me that one candidate said it was sunny and the other candidate said it was raining. They are going to tell me what they saw when they looked out the window in a way that perhaps for some reason CNN won't.
Well, they'll tell you one view out of the window these days. First thing to say, at a practical level, as a journalist, I actually long ago learned, and it's become an adage. There was a very major British television, a BBC person called Jeremy Paxman. He popularized it. It was actually said by a BBC correspondent in New York originally. You know, somebody said to him, "Why are you so aggressive about politicians?" And he answered, "Well, I approach all politicians that I'm interviewing, and I'm thinking to myself before they open their mouth, why is this lying bastard lying to me?" So my first response when anybody says anything about, well, how can I get around this, is why are these lying bastards lying to me? That becomes, in terms of the scientific protocol, which we're saying isn't prevalent in the press, that becomes, it is in the background of the press. It should be around, but it certainly should be in your mind as a consumer. The protocol is triangulate. Why are you believing this source? Have you got sources which you know are emanating from slightly different perspectives, which confirm the facticity of this, so you can make some determination? Those are the protocols that are involved in the disciplines that we mentioned at the outset as being of concern, which we examine in the book. You know, that's the way you do it. Otherwise, forget it. You know, I remember as a kid journalist in British television in the 60s. You know, I was told a story about the cub reporter sent to cover the train crash. He comes back, or she comes back, I should say, better these days. And she's, you know, her head is in her hands as she faces the screen, the typewriter, because the sights have been so upsetting. And the elderly hack pushes her aside and says, okay, what did you see? Discarded toys. Did you see any, you know, teddy bears lying by the side of the track, etc.? Otherwise, you formularize it in order to cope with it as a person, right? And then if you're consuming it, you have to know that those processes are revealing facts which can be triangulated. And also the other thing I think, Raza, that needs to be noted at this point is that if you look at the literature, objectivity is being, I mean, the scholarly J-school type American literature, which is far more sophisticated than it is here, or indeed in other countries, as far as I can tell. The fact of the matter is that there's the beginning of a debate about objectivity. People are historicizing objectivity, like Michael Schutzen, right? That, you know, they're saying we didn't have objectivity before, well, there's an argument, 1911 or 1835, according to well, I'm having a brain drop suddenly, Daniel Schiller, right? You know, and people have started to say, well, what is this? And even the Nyman reports, you know, have run the odd piece saying, you know, objectivity. Even Jay Rosen has been heard to maybe admit there might be something amiss here. So we're not out on an absolute limb here. We're probably being overly ferocious about it, but we're not, I think, quite alone, right? But the answer to the consumer is triangulate. I think that's all you can say.
Right, thank you. And before I go on to the next question, I do want to read a compliment from Clifford Christians, who says a compliment on the quality of scholarship throughout. The intellectual history of chapters 7 to 12 is comprehensive and a model of rigor. I appreciate you integrating that unequal foundation in chapters 7 to 12, chapters 1 to 6, and your subjective biased approach by returning to Schutzen's 6 functions.
Yes.
That's quite a compliment. So I thought maybe you need a break.
Coming from Cliff, it's beyond a compliment. Matthew and I, Cliff, I can see you, we mutter at each other about how absurd it is that we should be the recipients of such praise from yourself. Thank you.
Right. So
that it's nonstop learning for me from cover to cover, and this is just an observation about your integrating the argument of the book in a way that I thought was a powerful form of book communication.
Oh, well, bless you, Cliff.
Thank you. And so Susan Barron says, do you believe that there is an objective reality or truth, or is everything dependent on one's point of view?
Oh, René Descartes, you should be alive at this moment. No, I mean, I'm with Boswell. I kick the stone quite merrily, I think. However, the reason I wrote the book with Matthew is about to emerge. I needed somebody to say however to me.
We actually have a difference of opinion on this one. I'll answer mine with a story. When I was a PhD student, I really annoyed a lecturer I was having a chat with at one point, because I was talking about the social construction of reality. And she said to me, extremely exasperated, but surely you have to admit that some things have, you know, an objective external existence. They just exist. I mean, you know, there is a moon up there in the sky. And I looked at her, grinned smugly and said, it's a text. So that's my answer to the question. Brian kicks the stone. I remain on a tactical philosophical point of epistemology. Every time he brings up, you know, the newspaper report from 17th century Paris that there was a dragon in the sky over Paris, his assumptions, I think, you know, one possible explanation is that maybe when they said veritable, things weren't true, that they weren't always telling the truth. That is possible. I am open to the possibility that there was a dragon in the skies over Paris in 1654.
Well,
because I wasn't there.
I have a story from a British newspaper, a British and English newspaper, I should say, to be accurate. I think it's about 1611, of a serpent killing people, biting them, just outside Horsham, in the southeast, right, of England. And I actually propose in the book, don't I, Matthew? You let me put in a possible explanation of this story. The East India Company was founded in 1604, and the first ships came back from India, and maybe an adventurous sailor acquired a baby cobra, which he let loose in, you know, there are other stories about mysterious monsters being born in Lancashire in the first decade of the 17th century, obviously conjoined twins, I mean, from the description. So not everything, but they did have categories. And we use it as a chapter title. They had news, N-E-W-E-S, and they also had strange news, N-E-W-E-S. And news was fraught. If you said anything about anybody, the Polish ambassador, for instance, to the court of St. James at this time, immediately complains and you get locked up, right? So it's far better to go with strange news because you're less likely to suffer the consequences of the draconian censorship situation. So the bottom line is there a world out there? Well, I think there is. I mean, you know, I'm with Searle. I suppose I'm a pragmatist, essentially. And I think it can be reported, and I think facticity can be triangulated. And I think the purpose of the press and the people that one really admires are the people that move you and that actually illuminate the world for you. I'll just quote you one of my favorite sentences from the guy who wasn't a long form journalist. He was a senior correspondent called James Cameron, who went very early in. He was the first man to send back a film report from North Vietnam, from Hanoi. And in 60. And he went in with a cameraman and he was teaching himself how to be a filmmaker. And he's filmed sitting in Hanoi and he's surrounded by children. And he looks at the camera and he says, I used to live around here when we were witnessing, although we didn't know it, the fall of the French Empire at a place called Dien Bien Phu. It was in a Maison de la Presse, one of those strange places scattered across the globe, where journalists roost like vultures on the sickbeds of the world. Thank you. I carry that in my head. It says something about my trade. It tells me what I'm looking for. It's, you know, that's what I'm looking for. I don't want James Cameron. And James Cameron, by the way, also in his autobiography, goes on about the stupidities of objectivity. He said, I'm not interested. I was never interested in objectivity. Okay. So I think that, you know, we have to get over the objective hump and then we can start to see, then we're back with, you know, I don't know, these are the times that try, men's souls, you know. I mean, you get back to the stuff that really matters. that would be, I think, both of our pleas, really.
Right, thank you. Ian Shackner has a question. How should your work influence the ways in which we teach young people to consume and evaluate the credibility and messages from various news sources?
Why is this lying bastard lying to me? The
It
one
is.
message that no young person emerging into the world of the early 21st century should be without.
It's more. I think it matters to sort of, I think it matters that you have to think about newspapers or news sources. Sorry, my mind is always stuck in the print era. But you have to think about news sources more the way you would think about a movie critic. I'm a film geek. Rather than the way you sort of, the idea that, you know, this person tells this person tells only truth and this person tells only lies, that you'll have overlaps of interest, but you'll have difficulty, that everyone by definition is, that there is a person there. There isn't ever just a report of the truth or just a mirror on the world. There is always a subjectivity or a collection of subjectivities, as well as a production process. And to a certain extent, you know, it does just come back to a kind of a mix of caveat emptor and triangulation. Don't trust anybody, listen to everybody, put things together. Unfortunately, there may have been a time when we simply all conceded that there were agreed sort of facts and their relevance. I don't personally think there was, but if there was, it is gone. And now you unfortunately, you need to do some of the work yourself. And we need to help each other do the work. You know, my news consumption, you have to know what you're looking at. You have to, when I open Google News, as I do every day, I think, I have to know that a headline telling me that, for example, Brexit has been a disaster for the EU. They are desperate to have us back, and France is ready to hand back Normandy. would be quite alarming on the front page of the Times or the Guardian or the Independent, but on the front page of the Express or the Telegraph, it's just another Tuesday. You know, if I'm looking at Al Jazeera, it's one of the best news networks in the world. But if it's telling me about anything that the government of Qatar feels strongly about, it is telling me what the government of Qatar feels about it. The BBC isn't bad, but it tends to be pro government. And if they start talking about the royal family, I have to swap channels before I'll be sick in my mouth. And you know, unfortunately, to a certain extent, this information is more necessary than it used to be. We all join together in mocking Fox and Breitbart and things like the Mail, or I like calling them the Forgers Gazette because of the Zinoviev telegram. Some of us will never stop. You have to know the landscape rather than just your favorite address.
Absolutely right. My feeling is, I noticed Jean-Luc was not laughing when you suggested that the French were going to give back Normandy. My feeling about that is, obviously, I absolutely and totally agree with that. I mean, there are a number of quotations which I have now lost the source of. So I always say it's not my thought. But if anybody on this is a rather distinguished assembled company can remember, who was it said? I don't read newspapers. I've read them before. And I must confess that the Guardian arrives every morning at this house, and I don't read I mean, I skim the coverage of the, they're still swamping the paper with pandemic coverage, probably inevitably. And it's the same story every day. And it's not, you know, when you get to my age, you reach a point where you have a very strong feeling you've read it before. And if something brand new happens, somebody, I forget who said this too, you know, if somebody says somebody's appeared in Galilee, you know, saying they're the son of God and they've done this, that, and the other, the hack reporter is, or the hack sub-editor or editor is likely to say, oh, come on, no, I can't be bothered with that. I can't understand it. Anything you can't understand, you don't run with. And then everything you can understand is because you've run with it before. I mean, you know, the only answer is to triangulate. And by the way, to come back, really, we're coming to the end, I know, but to come back right at the beginning, Raza, is why would I have started this ball rolling with my son? It's exactly because he brings the perspective that I don't, as a tired old hack, any longer have. I mean, it takes a great deal for me to go, oh, that's interesting. I felt it needed some sort of, kick. And I knew that Matthew, every time he says anything, always, you know, provokes. So that's why, that's the source of this book, really, in family terms, at least.
Right. So there are a few other questions. So, and we have a few minutes left. So I'd start with the question. Well, there's another question from an earlier participant of this meeting, Harriet Malinowitz, who says, how do we deal with and teach students to deal with the fakery of venerable institutions such as the New York Times, for example, early age reporting, Judith Miller and the Iraq War, Wilding and the Central Park 5, current coverage of China, etc. So, yes, please.
The answer is still the same, right? The fact of the matter is the New York Times has put itself behind the 8 ball. But let me just say about those particular incidents, what's interesting about them, and here's where we are pro-press, totally pro-press, is that the vast majority of the output of the established platforms is not subject to those errors and distortions and direct lies, right? And hasn't been. You can use, as a historian, the record of the newspapers as a source. You know, you have to look out for these exceptions, but they are exceptions. And therefore, the answer to the question is, how do we teach young people, or how do we do it ourselves, is the same. You need to triangulate, you need to have multiple sources, and I suppose behind all of that, you need to have the insatiable desire that I'm sure motivates everybody whose screen I'm looking at the moment, which is that you want to know stuff. Whatever your discipline, whatever your approach is, you have to have an insatiable desire to understand the world about you. And that seems to me to be an absolute thing, which is obviously, for me, not ever having been trained as an educationalist, but having done it for umpteen decades, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to communicate to youngsters, to everybody, a desire to find out stuff. And in that, there's obviously a desire to find out about the stuff you're finding out about, how you're finding out about it. You need to find out about how you're finding out about it. So those are the things that really motivate. Well, they motivated my work, really, as much as anything else. I started as a disaffected member of the press in this country because I worked for a path-breaking you know, investigative journalism program, and I could see we weren't doing the job we said we were doing. That was how I became a professor and a media sociologist. It's all because I realized that, you know, working at the BBC, I realized, well, come on, no, this isn't what I paid to join, or this is what they're paying me, rather, but this isn't why I joined. So I think it's to do with actually that insatiable curiosity, that you know, that to understand the world about us is what all young people should emerge from education wanting, and then they should have the wherewithal to actually do this triangulation thing, etc., and understand, you know, what their ideological and intellectual formation is and has been.
Right. So I have two last questions, and we have just 3 minutes, literally. So, well, one is from our dear colleague here at Ithaca College, Rachel Chaff, who says that thank you both for this great conversation and congrats on the book. Matthew, you gestured toward this with your invocation of Stephen Colbert, and I can't help out to think of his notion of truthiness, Trevor Noah, etc. But I'm curious about your takes on news media, which is institutionally positioned as entertainment media, as most TV news outlets in the US are. Matthew, that's for you.
I think, again, it's a category error. The problem isn't, you know, I think Stephen Colbert is doing a much better job on a sort of philosophical and indeed practical level, partly because, not because he's subjective, everybody's subjective, but because you can tell. It's explicit, it's labeled, it's clear. It's this is my honest opinion, to say nothing of facticity, but also things being explicitly labeled as entertainment. All news is entertainment.
Yep.
By definition, unless they're making you watch it, to a certain extent, you know, unless you've got kind of a Soviet or 1984 style thing going, everyone will now stop and listen to the official news broadcast of whatever. By definition, this is show business. It's entertainment, it's culture. It's one of the things they have to do is get and keep your attention. And to a certain extent, yeah, it's, you know, fear or actual interest. I need to know what the budget was, but that's a tiny fraction. Knowing about the world is a form of entertainment, and it works better if you just acknowledge it. Is I think what I would say to that.
Thank you so much, Matthew. We do have 1 minute for the very last question, which I hope we can wrap up, because we do need to keep a few minutes for our final wrap up in this session. So Peter Stevens says, I agree that objective journalism is impossible. However, would you say that it can or should be a goal?
If you call it the search for facticity, yes.
Right.
Take the onus off the producer. Objectivity is a quality of the producer. Let's make it a quality of what they produce.
Very, very rightly and profoundly put. Thank you. And I would like request all the participants that if they can please put on your cameras so that we can give a round of applause to our wonderful speakers and authors. Thank you so much. So,
I want to see you all. I want to be with you all. It's not appalling being locked up. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Raza, for all of this. Thank you, Phil and Annie, and who else was there? There are other people around on the team. And Patty, bless you, as usual. Where will we all be without you?
Yeah.
And from me too, thank you, everyone.
Great.
Sorry.
No. And also just a little one. So our friend Maura has listed the website for our center, which is parkindymedia.org, and which has a list of reliable independent news outlets in the US. So please do visit when you can. Sorry, Patty, for the self-promotional tag at the end. But anyway, I thank you, Brian and Matthew, for a wonderful conversation. And I learned a lot. And your book indeed is fascinating, as well as packs so much of intellectual history of things that I engage here in classroom. And I'm sure many students who are in this session would also benefit from reading this book. And may I remind you all to please check out the book on Amazon.com or other outlet of your choice. It is Roots of look at the names of our authors and get a copy so that you can pick up on some of the debates and questions that were raised in this session. The roots of fake news, may I just remind again. And thank you once again. And hopefully we'll have you back at FLEFF for some other event very soon or in a couple of months, because this is an ongoing conversation here and globally. Thank you.
You can get 20% off. You didn't.
Thank you very much.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody. We'll do a little lessons learned here. Let's just wait till people leave.
Well, Gail, bye.
Yeah.
Talk to you in a minute.
Gail can stay.
Gail can stay.
Yeah.
Clifford, you should be able to stay too, my dear.
Yeah, we'll let them stay. Yeah,
Yeah, and Jill, gosh.
yeah,
it's
we'll let
wonderful
them
to see
stay.
you all,
So
and even the
yeah,
folks that
let's see. We have people here. If you're staying, we ask that you just leave your camera on. Just want to thank you, Matthew, Brian, and Raza. It was a really great session. I went into the back end analytics, and there were people here from the UK, France, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Canada, Hong Kong, Costa Rica, Mexico, Indonesia, and from at least 15 universities across the US and Canada. And there were actually several Ithaca College librarians here, which I think is really, really important for buying the book. And Raza, thank you so much.
Yes.
You win the FLEFF Award for starting on time and ending on time. Bravo. Yeah, and Annie and Phil, the intros and outros, perfect.
Yeah.
It all worked brilliantly. Thank you. Well, I mean, except for us.
Oh,
Yeah,
I
you
wanted
guys are
you to
great.
hold up the book though. I wanted to see it.
Well, I did try to hold
They
it up.
did.
But,
Okay.
you know,
It
I,
is a couple of times.
I couldn't see how to hold it up actually without saying at the same time, Annie, that you know, the parasitical quality of capitalist publishers is now reflected in the fact that they can't even afford to have a book cover. So this is my 20th. So this is out of the archive, right? This is my 20th book, and it's the first one that hasn't had a designer cover.
I love
Oh.
it.
And I mean, okay, it's the best we could do, but you know, they wouldn't. I mean, who knows?
Everyone's a critic.
Brian.
I just hope I did okay. I don't want to. I've never been part of anything like that before. This was strange. Sorry, don't mind me. I'm just rambling.
Strange,
Yeah.
right? Doing the launch on Zoom was strange.
Yeah.
I've never.
I had to get him to turn the Zoom on for the first time today. I have to tell you that you know, if he wants to be this revolutionary leader, he better get his act together about talking to people on
But
Zoom.
his comment now that this is strange is the best thing he could possibly say. I mean, it really is not a bad thing.
Yeah, no, this was great fun, and thank you, everyone.
Yeah, it was great. Just you were great, Matthew, and you both have such the repartee going back and forth where you agree, where you disagree, keeps it really, really quite lively and very exciting.
I stopped shouting at him several decades ago.
It's why it's
Not least because he's bigger than me now.
My biggest beef is I just printed out my order summary for the book, but you can't sign it. You know, it's like, this is the biggest frustration of this.
Raza, rest assured that Gail, my partner, who you can see in the corner of the screen here, and I have got it in our heads. We haven't actually told Patty and Stuart, but you know, we're going to make a grand tour as soon as we can. Clifford knows, I've told him we shall certainly show up in Urbana. I have a Chinese hotel.
Absolutely.
I don't know, Jill, you're in New York now, aren't you? I think, yes. You know, we intend to make sure we see everybody. So I fully expect, and also I have my flying status to maintain. I shouldn't say
Yes.
this environmental film, but you know.
Well, when you come to Ithaca,
Pollute more than aircraft, right? Triangulate that.
when you're double vaxxed, you come to Ithaca, we'll get the FLEFF team together and we'll have a celebratory dinner toasting the end of objectivity. We'll have an Irish wake for objectivity.
And we'll have read the book.
We will have read the book by then.
Yeah.
And I
Yes,
just want to say, Brian, you get first prize for set decoration.
You
You look
do.
fantastic. You are sitting, let me just explain. You are sitting in the golden section sweet spot of the screen, which is slightly off to one side at about 22/7.
I've
You
been doing
are,
this since 1963.
and you have a vanishing point behind you. You have this angled screen, and you have this really interesting little hand sitting there. You know, the lighting is great. The sound is good. That's even better.
3
So-
point. Actually, well,
This is set the
I've
bar
seduced
high.
the back life. I've seduced the back life. I do have a key and I do have a flood. I mean,
Yes.
come on, come on.
Thank you,
You have
BBC.
everything we need.
Old habits die hard, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But I have to tell you something that you can't actually see it. I misframed it, but if I actually lift the frame up, right? One of
Yeah.
our colleagues, Patty and Gail know him because we're working on a book together, all three of us. This is Steve Presence, right? And I was talking to him, in fact, when I was commissioning the chapter from him, and he said, "Oh, how opposite! You have the angel of history," and he recognized the clay on the wall.
Sure.
I can't quite see it, but yeah.
Yeah. But I haven't. But I mean, it's not in that sense curated. And in fact, I've been told that,
But
no,
Walter
because-
Benjamin
no,
would have been,
it is just my work environment, and I've been sat here since last March.
to have that on the wall, though, Walter Benjamin would be so proud of you.
Well, I know. Well, these are all folks that have had some sort of influence on one.
Well, yeah.
Well, it's really hard to get high praise from Annie for how
Well,
one
Annie, I'm
looks.
really pleased a fellow professional can actually, clock that. If you'd walked in and said, "Okay, where am I going to interview this clown?" "Oh, I know. I'll do him at his desk. Yeah, I'll get him to turn this way, and I'll fix the light."
No, the classic question is, where are you most comfortable to talk to your best friend? That's what we
Oh.
always ask somebody when we
Oh,
walk
I've never.
in.
Oh, that's news to me.
Well, it just helps. It's like, where would you sit?
Oh gosh, would you? Oh, would
Yeah.
you do that with most people? I don't know. No, I object very much to messing about. I must say, I don't believe in that. And I hate the matting. Actually, I noticed. Phil, you're matted, aren't you? But
Yeah, we are.
Yeah, but on this big screen, if I'm using the desktop, then obviously you can see the rest of the room, which is my bedroom, and I don't think it's appropriate for an elderly professor to be addressing from their bedroom. So I've actually put myself against the photograph of the shells taken by De Geer in 1839, the source of all nonsense about the objectivity of the photograph, of course. But nobody said to me, "Oh, I see you've got the De Geer 1839 photograph of the shells."
We have about 2 minutes, and we will have to wrap it up because we have actually another event coming up that we have to
Sure.
prep for. But Raza, did you have any lessons learned, final comments?
No, not really. I think all I have to say is wonderful speakers, and thank you, Patty, Phil, and Annie, and all the FLEFF team.
Yes.
For
Grace.
And I'm gonna,
Sorry, I forgot
Grace, big
Yeah.
shout out to Grace.
Sorry, Grace. Yes.
You are both gifted educators, Brian, Matthew, and made this 90 minutes supremely worthwhile.
Thank you so much, Cliff. Thank you.
Thank you, Clifford. Yeah, that 90 minutes flew by. I know we were
For
debating.
sure.
You're always in your Zoom universe. It's like you do 45, 60, 75, 90. And, you have to figure out what fits. And I think we all figured you were both talkers. So and then you throw in Raza and his brilliant moderation. you know, I think it was the right length.
I
So
was-
Great. Anyway, lovely to see you all. And
lovely to see you
indeed,
all. And I'll leave you with one last data analytic. There were 68 people who signed up. And as Raza and Annie and Phil and Tom and I know, usually you get 40 to 50% of who signed up, right, for these kind of Zoom events. And this one had 55 people out of 68. So it's a very, very high number. And literally from all over the world, all over the US, all over Canada. And there was a mix of students. I recognized a couple, Grace, that were my former students and current students, and all the way up through professors, librarians, retired people. So really, really a fantastically heterogeneous audience. Thanks to all of you on the screen for pushing out and getting it. So Brian, Matthew, thank you so much. And I would be remiss without really thanking our producers, Phil Wild and Ann Michelle, who are just keep it all so tight. And thank you, Raza. Thank you, Grace. And everybody needs to know Grace is a student on our team, and she got drafted 10 minutes before it started with a job she didn't know she was going to have. Great job, Grace. Terrific on the links. And so thank you, everybody, for coming, and bravo. And we hope that the book really makes a great impact in the world and in academia.
thank you.
And see you later this week if you can make them.
Yeah,
So
come to
yeah,
more of
come
our
to more
events,
of us,
everybody.
please.
We'll see
Okay,
you.
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Whoops, where am I?
Bye.
Bye, Gail. Good to
Hi,
see
Gail. Talk in a
you.
minute.
Bye, everyone. Thank you again.
Bye, Brian.
Thank you, Brian,
Bye, Matthew.
Matthew. So
We did it.
We
I
did it.
loved. I think I really like the ending thing, Patty. That
so
really
let me
worked.
ask this really quickly
Well, you
before
thought
we,
of it, like turn on your camera, applause.
But you told people, and then they gave them something to do. And the two guys, those two gentlemen, the Winstons, they just were thrilled. You know, it really was for them as much as anything. You know,
They
Talk me through-
loved it at the end.
wait, talk me through this. I recorded it. I'm the one that's doing it. How
Just
do
hit
I
stop.
how do I save it then?
it stays automatically
To what?
to the FLEFF
It goes to the
at
fluff
Ithaca.
email.
But I'm not on the FLEFF system. I'm on my own.
Here,
I didn't come in from that, so.
this is not, I'm gonna cancel it now.
Okay.